Hello, my name is David Butchafaro, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the first in a series of podcasts brought to you by the New York State Psychiatric Rehabilitation Training Academy. These podcasts are one of many resources that will be made available to participants in the Training Academy. We hope that you will use these podcasts in conjunction with future trainings to enhance your understanding and use of psychiatric rehabilitation. Today's inaugural podcast is titled Using Psychiatric Rehabilitation to Support People to Develop Skills and Resources to Reach Their Goals. Your presenters today are Marianne Farkas, Kelly Gamble, and Michael Seibold. So without further delay, here are Marianne, Kelly, and Michael.
Hello, everyone. My name is Marianne Farkas, and I am the Director of Training, Dissemination, and Technical Assistance at the Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation, one of the partners working with NIAPRIS on this project. In this podcast, we are going to listen to some stories from people who have worked with psychiatric rehabilitation in the field. Just say a few words to introduce yourself, and then I'll ask you some questions about your experience.
Okay, sure. So my name is Michael Seibold, and I am currently retired, but worked for 41 years for an organization in central Massachusetts. We worked very closely with Boston University through the whole development of their approach, worked for many years implementing that approach and using that approach in our own organization.
Thanks, Mike. Kelly, a sentence or so about yourself.
Sure. I'm Kelly Gamble. I worked at the same organization as Michael as the Director of Mental Health Services and spent over 30 years overseeing psychiatric rehabilitation services, and which included training and supervising staff in using the model.
Thank you. Thank you. So let's start talking about the psychiatric rehabilitation process. Psychiatric rehabilitation, as we all know, starts where the person is at because it's a person-centered approach. Mike, I think you've had experiences working with people who are not really willing or able to think about goal setting, which is kind of the beginning of psychiatric rehabilitation. When you or your team met them, can you talk a little bit about that and what steps the psychiatric rehabilitation approach guided you to take with them?
Sure, Marianne. I supervised a staff person named Bill, who worked in a day program designed for people with mental health challenges. Bill worked with a fellow named Stephen. Stephen was a man in his early 30s who lived in a highly structured group home that served just 4 individuals. And Stephen and his housemates were difficult to engage and required a lot of support and training to relearn many basic skills. So when Stephen came to the day program, he preferred to essentially stay by himself. In fact, when the weather was mild, Stephen preferred to sit outside on the ground and just smoke cigarettes. He really refused to participate in most, if not all, of the program's activities. So Bill understood that Stephen wasn't ready to engage in discussion about his future goals. So what Bill decided to do was develop rapport with Stephen simply by sitting on the ground across from him and smoking cigarettes while he tried to make conversation with Stephen. Listening to Stephen was a big part of that. So they sat there for hours over the course of numerous weeks, and slowly Stephen began to share a little bit more about himself. And the two of them also ended up playing a lot of chess, because through these conversations, Bill learned that one thing Stephen did like to do was play chess. After a while, Bill invited Stephen to come inside and participate in some of the program's readiness development activities. These included exploring with Stephen possible interests and preferences that he might have in working and in living, completing some exercises that helped him identify some of the things that he really valued. Also, they supported Steve to visit other people with mental health challenges that were living successfully in the community to simply hear about their own experiences with that. And also, Stephen went on a number of field trips into the community, just various communities, just to to see what those communities had to offer in terms of resources and other amenities. So those are the readiness activities that Stephen participated in. This, of course, was over a good amount of time. And eventually Stephen began to talk about the fact that he'd prefer to live on his own someday, getting his own place.
Great. So, Mike, it sounds like the key to that success in terms of getting him to go from not being ready to even thinking about a goal to actually participating in some goal activities was to start with where he was at, which in this case meant literally starting by sitting with him on the ground and giving him the time to develop that relationship and that rapport, and then trying to stimulate his interest in various aspects of communities or housing until he got to the point where it was something that he wanted to think about. Now, obviously, this takes time, as you pointed out, and sometimes it's a challenge to get that arc of time available in a program. But there are ways of being able to organize the work so that it meets the funding and regulation requirements, but still allows you to be where the person is and to give that person the time they need to emotionally become involved in thinking about a role or a goal. Okay, so now that we've talked about getting somebody involved in goal setting, let's talk a little bit about goal setting. Kelly, a lot of people think that goal setting is about coming up with something concrete that you can do quickly, like focusing on something like budgeting your money or making your bed. As we know, Psych Rehab focuses on helping people to figure out what the next role that they want is, a role that is valued in society and can represent a big step for people. Could you, Kelly, talk a bit about working with a person in your residential program who, unlike Mike's client, might have been ready to think about their next important life role and still needed the structure of a psych rehab process to set that role goal that they wanted to reach over the following 6 to 24 months?
Yes, I can. Thanks, Marianne. I think residential setting is the key phrase because the obvious role there is the living environment. And if someone's in a 24/7 staffed group home, the next obvious role change would be to be a tenant in the community. And so when I first met Peg, she lived in a 15-person group home. And when we started oversight of that particular program, we felt like it was just a mini institution in the community and really sought to assess the 15 folks who live there and help each one of them figure out what was next. With Peg, it seemed very obvious to me and seemed obvious to her that she didn't need that level of service. In fact, prior to living in that group home, spent a few years in the state institution. But prior to that living environment, Peg was a social worker, in fact, in that same institution. So Peg had her break after having a career as a social worker, lived in the hospital, and then moved out into the group home. Peg was really able to demonstrate a hopefulness about another role and moving on, and also was able to engage in conversation about her past and current living experiences. So it just seemed like she was ready, but didn't know the next step and sort of how to take it. So the structure of a psych rehab process and helping her identify sort of what does she want in that next place and what are the options that are out there for her. So we identified a number of different living options. One of her sort of personal criteria was that she didn't want 14 roommates, but she did in fact want one. So that was a key aspect of something we were looking for as we helped her seek an apartment out in the community, looking for a 2-bedroom and identifying who she might have as a roommate. So we explored the different options that were out there for her and helped weigh each one against what she wanted in the next place and helped her make the decision. I want this apartment and I'm going to seek to move in there in 6 months was essentially her goal.
Okay. So Kelly, what you're saying is that the role change that happened for Peg was moving from being really a patient in an inpatient setting that was highly structured with lots of other people, even if it was in the community, to being the tenant in an apartment of her own and sharing that with another person. And that large step was something that she herself wanted, but it sounds like you helped her to make that decision by helping her to get information about what was important to her in that new role, what the options were, what those different characteristics of the different options implied in terms of what was important to her, and then gave her a method of putting the two together.
Right.
I mean, that's what I understand you to mean when you say you helped her to make the decision. It isn't that you guided her in the decision making, right?
No, right. It was that we together sort of researched and, explored with her and then researched what was out there and helped her make those comparisons for what was the best match for her.
Okay. So thank you. That is an example of what it takes to establish a life goal or a role goal over the next 6 to 24 months that really reflects the person's perspective and not the provider's perspective. It's teaching people how to make a decision based on their personal criteria and the options. So once you have that goal, then the next piece that becomes really important is figuring out whether or not the person in question has the skills and supports that they need to be successful and satisfied there. So Kelly, once Peg knew what that goal was, can you describe what was the most important few skills or supports that she had or needed to have to be successful and satisfied as a tenant living with a roommate in that particular flat?
Sure. So Peg ended up moving into a 2-bedroom apartment with Renee, and they had been roommates in this group home for quite some time. So they knew each other. But again, staff was around, 24/7 for any kinds of supports or assistance that people needed. When they moved into their own place, in fact, one skill we identified with Peg before they moved, which is around conflict resolution, that she understood that she would need to be able to negotiate with Renee and sort of navigate through any interpersonal conflicts or any other kinds of conflicts that they had. So that was one of the skills that we identified. It came out in a couple of ways. One was around what to watch on TV, since they just had one television. But a bigger one had to do with their meal planning. And so we did some work because initially they decided to do meals together, grocery shop together and do meals together. And once they learned that didn't work out, they weren't able to sort of negotiate with each other about how to move into a different sort of meal situation. So we did role plays. I did role plays with Peg, and Renee's staff person practitioner did role plays with her around trying to help them make a decision about how to handle meals. So they ended up buying separately and cooking separately instead of together. From a resource perspective, again, they're in a setting where staff were around whenever anybody wanted staff around, or even when they didn't. But in your own apartment, there's an outreach sort of service capacity that Peg identified that she would like. So she didn't want to leave a 24/7 staffed setting and go into an apartment without any structure of what kind of supports that she would get. So there was an outreach service that we helped Peg apply for and work with her counselor around what their schedule would look like, how often, how long, what would they do together, that sort of thing. So that was a support that we identified pretty quickly.
Thank you. I think once when you and I were talking, you also mentioned that a way that your agency had of helping people to integrate better into the community was to create a resource when one might not have existed. And I think the example that you gave me was creating a book club.
Right.
I wonder if you could talk for a minute about how that book club became a resource in being able to integrate into the community.
Sure. That's another actually really good example, because what our agency does is seek or create inclusive opportunities for people. So instead of a book club that participated in by only people with mental illnesses or folks in our services, we sought to create a book club that was inclusive of members of the community, in addition to accessibility for participants in our program. And so in this instance, we ended up creating a book club rather than finding one that existed, and we invited different members of the community as sort of volunteers, but people who had a genuine interest in a book club. And that was an interest of Peg's as well. And so it served to create a space for her to be able to participate in something side by side with other community members And in that sense, she also had a valued role as a book club member, receiving very natural supports from other community members in an activity that was of mutual interest.
Great. So the two kinds of resources that you identified were one resource, which was a service that already existed that you could help Peg link up with, and the other was kind of a resource or a support that didn't exist in the form of a book club, and that you as an agency created in order to help that integration process. I wonder if you could say a few last words about the skill development. You mentioned that you helped Peg with negotiating with her roommate about the meal plan, but did you teach her a skill, or how did you develop that skill?
Right. In this instance, with Peg, she already possessed the skills. She had a number of different interpersonal skills that she used in her career and in her life prior to the onset of her illness. So with Peg, it was more talking with her and observing her and thinking through, okay, what might be getting in the way of you being able to reflectively listen with Renee, or together you guys being able to engage in conflict resolution by identifying, what was the conflict? What's my role in it? What's your role in it? So really working through with Peg what we knew those conflict resolution and negotiation skills were, and what of those was she not able to sort of engage in, and figure out why that was.
So what you're saying is that because Peg already had the skill of negotiating, what you had to focus on was why she couldn't use it effectively in that apartment setting with this particular roommate. And that involved identifying what the barriers were, and then coming up with some steps to address those barriers to develop the skill that she already had, right?
Yes. Yep. So how to get around those barriers for her.
Oh, okay. So what you've heard so far today has been an example of what was done with a particular client who was not ready or willing to start thinking about goal setting from the beginning. And another example of somebody who was ready to start thinking about goal setting, but didn't have a process that they could use to walk through in a systematic way and make a choice about what role and where they wanted to live in the community. And then something about critical skill that they needed to make that work, and some critical resources that were important. And essentially, psychiatric rehabilitation is all of those components in a process that starts from where the person is and teaches the person along the way not only what they need to learn, but also how to do this process on their own. So thank you, Kelly and Michael, and thank you everyone for your attention.
Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to Marianne, Kelly, and Michael for this very informative podcast. I learned a lot today and hope you did as well. Remember, this is only the first in a series of podcasts that will be provided to you as participants in the Psychiatric Rehabilitation Academy. Please continue to follow us on our website, which can be found at psychrehabacademy.org, for future podcasts and other events that will be offered by the Academy. Until our next time, be well, be safe, and keep believing. Thank you.